Mom, I can't take it anymore. It's impossible with only $100 a month for allowance. Emily, my daughter who had moved to New York for college, had come home several times a year, but I had never heard such a complaint from her. What? I've been transferring $2,200 every month. At first, I couldn't understand what Emily was talking about. I raised my voice in surprise, but Emily shouted back, equally surprised. What? 2,200 do? Could the transfer have gone to the wrong account? No, that couldn't be. If the transfer had been wrong, I would have heard from my sister-in-law and her husband. The monthly allowance was actually being transferred to their account. Considering Emily's busy college life and the possibility of her forgetting to pay rent, I had been transferring the combined amount for her living expenses and rent to my sister-in-law's account. They were supposed to hand over $1,600 to Emily after deducting rent. Emily, crying on the phone, wouldn't lie about such things. No way, a thought crossed my mind. One I didn't want to consider, but it seemed the only explanation. After ending the call with Emily, I hurried to a certain place. My name is Julia, 47 years old. Currently, I work part-time at a local supermarket. Since marrying my husband Jeff, we had 2 children. Our son Chris is 23 this year. Emily, our daughter, is 20 and currently studying at a university in New York. Emily has always been a bit scatterbrained and lively, so I never imagined she would get into one of the top universities in New York. Unlike Emily, Chris was always serious and good at his studies from childhood, but he's almost in a state of seclusion now. The trigger for his seclusion was failing his college entrance exams. Chris, being introverted, had few friends and took pride in being more academically inclined than his socially active sister Emily. He always told himself, studying is more important than playing for the future. He might have also harbored a feeling of not wanting to lose to Emily, who was enjoying her youth. Despite maintaining top grades in high school, Chris failed his college entrance exams. Everyone thought his admission was a sure thing, so the shock was tremendous for him. He couldn't understand why he failed. On the day of the results, expecting his success, we prepared a lavish meal and waited for his return. But the moment he came back, I knew something terrible had happened. He had a look of despair I had never seen before. Since then, Chris barely left his room. He's not aggressive towards us and communicates when necessary, but he shows no signs of improvement. But he shows no intention of working. Whenever we bring up employment, he shuts down. Emily, witnessing Chris's failure, seemed to have put in her own effort in her way. She studied diligently in secret, balancing it well with her leisure time. She had a clear dream of becoming a teacher and aimed for a prestigious university for that purpose. She succeeded, much to the astonishment of Chris, who couldn't believe it. Though not on bad terms, Emily's university acceptance seemed to have accelerated Chris's withdrawal. With Emily living in a dorm in New York and Chris in seclusion, our family's finances were stretched thin, even with my husband working. Having been a stay-at-home mom for many years, I decided to start working at a local supermarket due to these circumstances. Having never worked outside since getting married, everything felt new and challenging, but I had no choice but to work hard for my kids. Emily, who moved to New York for college, was living in an apartment managed by my husband's sister, Michelle, and her husband. Michelle's husband earns a living through real estate management, inherited from his parents. I'm truly grateful for their support, especially since college tuition alone is quite expensive. I hadn't seen Michelle and her husband since our wedding, so honestly, I didn't know them very well. Now that they were renting a room to Emily at a discounted rate, I started communicating with them over the phone. My only impression of them was from a brief conversation at the wedding, and I felt uneasy about their offer. Back then, it was clear they didn't think highly of me. There was a family gathering just before the wedding, and throughout, they seemed displeased. Even when I greeted them, their responses were curt, to the point where I thought, I'd rather not deal with these people. We hadn't interacted for a long time, but with Emily's college enrollment, Jeff reached out to them. Have you been keeping in touch with your sister regularly? I asked Jeff, feeling anxious, but his response was vague. Yeah, we chat occasionally, and I trust my sister completely. It was obvious they weren't in close contact, But Jeff seemed to have a lot of trust in his sister. Not wanting to sound bitter, I agreed to accept their offer. Emily, too, seemed apprehensive about relying on an aunt she hadn't met, but she couldn't complain. She readily agreed to our suggestion. Once Emily started living in Michelle's apartment, Jeff started receiving frequent calls from his sister. I thought she was just concerned about Emily, but listening to their conversations, it didn't seem that way. She's just nervous because she hasn't seen you guys in years. Can you cut her some slack? It appeared Michelle and her husband were displeased with Emily's behavior, but what did they expect from Emily, their niece? Since Emily herself didn't complain, I assumed they were only venting to Jeff, but my anxiety grew day by day. Can I really trust these people with Emily? I subtly asked Jeff if Emily was getting along with them, but he always evaded the question. Emily wouldn't tell me the truth out of consideration, so all I could do was trust Michelle and her husband. But that trust was soon betrayed. One day when Jeff and I were shopping at a department store, I was buying groceries while Jeff wanted to check out a different floor. Seeing no reason to object, I let him go. I finished shopping earlier than usual and went to look for Jeff on the second floor. Just as I was about to call him, I saw him in a high-end brand store. What is he doing? I wondered, feeling uneasy. I approached him and asked, "What are you doing here?" Startled by my sudden appearance, Jeff looked visibly flustered. Well, it's just that. He seemed to have bought something and a salesperson was packing the item. Could you please confirm the shipping address? Upon questioning Jeff, I learned that the purchase was for Michelle. She's taking care of Emily and she insisted on a gift, he explained. Appalled, I immediately suggested moving Emily to another place, but Jeff refused, saying it would be disrespectful to Michelle and her husband. Fortunately, Emily seemed unharmed, and Jeff pleaded, "Let's just see how things go a little longer." Overwhelmed by his earnestness, I agreed to maintain the status quo. About a year after Emily started college, a phone call from her revealed a shocking truth. "Mom, I can't take it anymore. Surviving on just $100 a month allowance is impossible." I had heard nothing like this from Emily, who had come home several times a year. "What? I'm transferring $2,200 every month." Initially, I couldn't understand what Emily was talking about. I blurted out in shock, but Emily, not to be outdone, yelled back, "What? $2,200? Could the transfer have gone to the wrong account? No, that couldn't be. If it had, my sister-in-law and her husband would have contacted us. I was transferring the monthly allowance to their account because, with Emily's busy life at college in New York, forgetting to pay rent would be disastrous. So I had been sending the combined amount for her living expenses and rent to them. They were supposed to give Emily $1,600 after deducting the rent. Emily, crying on the phone, couldn't be lying. She must have been living on the edge. I hurriedly transferred a few $1,000s to Emily's account, even before verifying the facts with my sister-in-law. But there was someone else I needed to talk to. I needed to talk to someone before that. My son Chris, he's the one who's been making the monthly transfers to Emily. Although Chris has been mostly confined to his room, I had asked him to do the transfers, so he would occasionally step outside. I trusted him with this important task, hoping it would be meaningful for him. I couldn't imagine Chris stealing the allowance. But he might know something. With a heavy heart, I knocked on Chris's door. "Chris, I just got a call from Emily. She says she's only receiving $100 a month." A heavy sigh came from inside the room. "You think I stole it?" Chris's direct response caught me off guard. Sensing the slight doubt I had harbored, I hastily denied it, but Chris didn't respond further. That night, when Jeff came home, I immediately shared this puzzling situation. "That's it. I need to have a serious talk with Chris." Jeff seemed convinced Chris had stolen the money, probably thinking it made sense given Chris's reclusive state and lack of income. Packages, likely bought online, were frequently delivered to Chris. Jeff suspected these were bought with the money meant for Emily. "It's not decided yet, is it? Can you please contact your sister to see if she knows anything?" I asked, wanting to believe in Chris. Jeff seemed to think I was suspecting his sister and responded irritably, "You think my sister stole it? If you're so sure, why don't you call her yourself?" Feeling it was pointless to continue discussing with Jeff, I decided to contact my sister-in-law. When I told her about Emily's call, she reacted so dramatically that it almost seemed exaggerated. "What? You're transferring $2,200? I'm only getting $700 a month." She should have been receiving $600 for rent, so her reaction made me question why she hadn't found it strange that Emily was only receiving $100. "Jeff said your son is the one making the transfers, right?" From her tone, it was clear she suspected Chris had taken the money. "Indeed, I asked my son to make the transfers every month, but there's no way he would do anything to trouble his sister." I was angered by her insinuations and blurted out defensively, "So what are you saying? Are you accusing us of stealing the money you sent?" She was furious one moment, and then abruptly hung up the phone the next. I just wanted to know if she had any idea about the situation, but her accusatory tone towards Chris felt off to me. A few days after Emily's call, I received a call from a hospital in New York on my cell phone. It turned out that Emily had collapsed from overwork and was rushed to the hospital. Though they assured me her life wasn't in danger, I hurried to her side. After getting the call. Led by a nurse, I entered Emily's hospital room and saw her lying there much more gaunt than before. "Mom, I'm sorry for worrying you," she whispered weakly, forcing a smile from me. After the call, I had transferred some money to her, but it seems her previous overexertion had caught up with her. She told me she had been working night shifts after college classes every day. With just $100 from my sister-in-law, she couldn't even cover her utility bills, let alone food and transportation expenses. "Why didn't you say anything when you came home?" I asked through tears, but Emily simply said she didn't want to worry me. Had my sister-in-law Michelle not noticed Emily's condition over the past year? Shouldn't she have shown some concern? Although I had been grateful to Michelle and her husband for providing a cheap room, my gratitude had now turned to anger. I explained to Emily that I'd be staying in New York for a bit, and then headed straight to Michelle's house. When I rang the doorbell and announced myself, Michelle seemed surprised to see me. "Well, yeah, collapsing from just $100 a month isn't surprising," she said with a laugh when I told her about Emily's condition. "Aren't you concerned? Didn't you notice anything odd about Emily?" I demanded, unable to contain my anger. "Who do you think you are? Blaming us? Do you realize who's been allowing your daughter to live?" With a ferocity as if she was about to lunge at me, my sister-in-law yelled. I had felt something was off during our phone conversation, and now it was clear. It seemed like she had something to hide and was getting defensive when accused, which couldn't be helped. "First of all, your good-for-nothing son. It's obvious he's been stealing the money. And you're blaming us? Do you have any proof?" Michelle insulted Chris and ended our conversation abruptly, slamming the door in my face. I stayed in New York for a while to watch over Emily. During this time, I told her about the allowance and that Chris was responsible for transferring it. "Aunt Michelle says my brother stole it?" "No way, Chris would never do that," Emily said, her voice filled with disbelief. Listening to her, I realized Emily had been suspicious of Michelle and her husband's actions since starting college. She thought it unlikely that I would only provide a $100 allowance, but was too afraid to bring it up, fearing a mistake. My heart ached for her consideration. A few days later, after all the tests confirmed there was no serious issue, Emily's color improved and she was discharged. "I'm sorry for all the worry, but I'm fine now," she reassured me. Despite her lingering distrust towards Michelle and her husband, I was just grateful that Emily was okay. And her husband Emily was also worried about Chris. Indeed, I was concerned whether Jeff had said anything to Chris, accusing him of theft. I handed Emily enough money and decided to return home for the time being. Upon returning home and checking with my husband, it seemed there was no contact from my sister-in-law. He also hadn't spoken much with Chris, which was a relief, as it meant the worst-case scenario was avoided. I went to see Emily and also stopped by Michelle's. I told Jeff about Emily's worn-out state and her overworking for living expenses. I subtly criticized Michelle and her husband for their lack of concern. Michelle is busy and probably only sees Emily when handing over the money each month. Jeff said he was more concerned about his sister than his own daughter's health. Aren't you worried about your daughter collapsing? I asked, is Michelle that important to you? She's calling Chris a thief. Jeff frowned at my words. It's obvious Chris did it, isn't it? What about all the packages he receives? How else would he afford them? He said excitedly, then realized he had gone too far. He seemed to regret speaking so harshly. Anyway, please stop speaking ill of my sister. Maybe ask Chris if he knows anything. Saying this, my husband left the room, looking embarrassed. After a while, I heard the door on the second floor open. It was Chris coming out of his room. He must have overheard our earlier argument because we had raised our voices. Coming down the stairs, Chris let out a big sigh and looked me in the eyes. I swear I didn't steal any money. There's no way I would steal Emily's important money. His face was earnest, and it was unusual for him to leave his room and come to me like this. He must really want to clear his suspicion. Mom, I'll go to Aunt Michelle's and ask her directly. I nodded emphatically at Chris's words. The next day, Chris and I headed straight to Michelle's house. It had been years since I last went out with Chris. Despite the situation, I couldn't help but think about that. Throughout the train ride, Chris was silent, but from his demeanor, I was convinced Michelle and her husband were stealing the money. Chris's eyes said it all, and he was worried about Emily. He couldn't forgive Michelle and her husband for putting his dear sister through this. He said he was going to ask, but I knew he wanted to confront them about their actions. He couldn't stand the thought of being wronged more than their disregard for Emily. When we arrived at the station, we immediately went to Michelle's house. I assumed if we called ahead, they would find a reason to turn us away. Sure enough, Michelle was clearly flustered by our unexpected visit. She seemed incredulous that Chris, whom she had heard was reclusive, was here. Aunt Michelle, sorry to bother you suddenly. About Emily's allowance, I have been transferring $2,200 every month without fail. Is this the correct account number? Chris didn't give Michelle a chance to interject, showing her the account number noted on his smartphone. This is important. Can you please check it right now? Michelle looked hesitant, but urged by Chris, she went to get her bank book. When she returned with it, Chris didn't waste a moment. Is this right? Can you confirm the number for me? After Chris recited the account number, Michelle responded, "It seems correct." Hearing this, Chris nodded and continued, "I thought so. Could you please open that book and show us? If the amount written is $700, then I must have made a mistake." Chris was straightforward, looking Michelle in the eyes. Indeed, if Michelle was right about Chris stealing the money, it would all be proven by that book. Mom said that when she visited last time, you were sure I was stealing the money, right? If you show us now, she'll be convinced, won't she? Whether her son is lying or not. It was like a scene from a detective show, with Chris trying to prove his innocence. Michelle, on the other hand, was just standing there, overwhelmed by the situation. Why do I have to show you what's in my bank book? Are you saying I stole it? Michelle was clearly agitated and snapped at Chris. But Chris didn't rise to her provocation, staying calm. I'm not saying you stole anything, Aunt Michelle. Maybe there was some trouble with the system. Anyway, can you please show us where the depositor's name says Chris? I joined in, urging her, please, we just want to clear this up. Michelle's face turned red as she screamed, "Enough already. Don't act all high and mighty when you're the one stealing the money." She was like a child throwing a tantrum, trying to chase us out. Then, as my sister-in-law shouted, "Get out!" Chris, defying her, squeezed out a forceful response. "I'll prove you stole it, no doubt about it." Chris's intense voice silenced my sister-in-law for a moment. Seeing this, Chris said, "That's enough for today," and turned his back to her. I followed Chris without a word, unable to speak. "Chris! Wait, Chris!" When I looked at his face, it was distorted with frustration. He was upset about not being able to prove his innocence. "I shouldn't have spoken to you like I doubted you. But listen, I don't think you stole anything anymore." I said this firmly, apologizing wholeheartedly to Chris. In response, as if answering my words, he muttered, "I know." I suggested visiting Emily, who was recovering. But Chris, still unable to prove his innocence, probably felt he couldn't face her. I couldn't face her. "Can I go home first?" he asked, then headed towards the station alone. After visiting Emily, I returned home later than Chris. He had returned before me and was holed up in his room as usual, trying not to be noticed by my husband. Jeff too seemed embarrassed since then, avoiding both me and Chris. Pretending to bring food, I entered Chris's room. "I'm sorry, I couldn't do more. Emily is feeling better now, so don't worry." Hearing about Emily's recovery, Chris seemed relieved and opened up. "I'm sorry for always causing worry. I've been doing some work online bit by bit, but I couldn't bring myself to say it." His confession surprised me, and I let out an involuntary sound. Listening to Chris's story, I slowly understood what he meant. "Years of being a recluse would naturally make people suspect me of stealing," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. To prove where the money for his packages came from, Chris revealed his secret. After failing his exams, he had initially escaped reality, doing nothing. But then, realizing he couldn't continue like that, he started self-studying programming and design. Chris, a quick learner and studious by nature, had grown to the point where he could earn money with these skills over the past few years. "I'm still an amateur, so I was going to tell you when I could make a living out of it." Tears naturally flowed as I listened to my son's unexpected confession. Seeing me cry, Chris laughed, saying, "Don't cry, it's all right." But I knew he must have felt guilty inside. Shaking off his own insecurities, Chris spoke up again. "There's something else I want to talk to you about, Mom." And so he began to speak with conviction. "That's why I came here." The next day in our living room sat my sister-in-law, Christy. The content of Chris's conversation from yesterday was about another aunt of his, Christy. After his exam failure, Christy, who had always been close to Chris, showed more concern for him than even we did. His interest in programming started under her influence. Hearing about Emily's allowance issue, Chris first consulted with Christy. She had always known about the bad blood between Christy and my sister-in-law, Michelle. Unlike my husband Jeff, who had absolute trust in Michelle, Christy didn't trust her. She was close enough to visit our house occasionally, but hated Michelle. Indeed, Christy had always been very helpful to me, more straightforward than Michelle. Christy suggested framing Michelle to make her confess. He seemed lively and happy around Christy, a rare sight for me. Grateful to Christy for making Chris this happy, I felt I couldn't thank her enough. That jerk making my dear nephew and niece suffer. Suffer like this. I'll expose her soon, Christy said, eager to teach Michelle a lesson, as she and Chris enthusiastically planned together. Without Christy, I shudder to think what might have become of Chris. Watching them, I felt conflicted as a parent, but I had no choice but to rely on Christy's plan. We readied ourselves and decided to confront Michelle again the next day. I was determined to make her regret insulting my dear son. Containing my eagerness, we prepared for the next day. The following day. Did Jeff suspect anything? Christy asked while munching on her lunch on the train heading to Michelle's house. Fortunately, Jeff seemed his usual self, unaware of our plan. I was worried he might side with his sister if he found out about our plan at this stage. He cares about Chris and Emily, but for some reason, he can't stand up to his sister. According to Christy, their relationship has always been like that. It's not so much about trust or admiration, it's more like he can't defy her. She said with a sense of resignation. Compared to my serious and dull husband, Christy was bright and carefree. She grew up seeing her sister-in-law bossing around her brother and was determined not to end up like that. Christy is still single and makes a living as a freelancer. Though Chris had failed his exams, seeing Christy living independently and on her terms must have inspired him not to give up. We enjoyed our time together, but soon we would be arriving in New York. Christy's plan seemed surprisingly simple, almost childlike, but she was confident. "This is where I excel," she said, pointing to her head and smiling at me and Chris. "Thanks. What's going on here?" Arriving at Michelle's house, Christy confronted her in a seemingly distressed manner. Michelle seemed utterly unprepared for Christy's visit. "I deposited the money for Chris once, and now I'm being accused of stealing it?" Following Christy's instructions, Chris and I stayed hidden near Michelle's house, watching the two of them. "What? Why would you make the deposit for Chris?" Michelle asked, her anger evident. Because I live nearby. Unlike Chris, I keep proper transaction records. At her words, Michelle's face turned pale. What do you mean by that? Are you also saying I stole it? Christy wouldn't let her get away with playing dumb. So where did the $1,600 go? Never mind, I'll take the transaction records and go to Jeff. As Christy turned to leave, Michelle immediately shouted, wait, just wait a minute. I understand. Christy's plan worked perfectly, and Michelle took the bait. Say, I was told by Chris to let him take some of the money for himself. It's obvious that Jeff will believe me over a reclusive son. At that moment, Christy grinned mischievously. Big sis, are you admitting that you stole Emily's money? Michelle, thinking Christy was shaking her down, clicked her tongue and responded, as usual with you. It's obvious, isn't it? It was indeed as we suspected. Watching this exchange, Chris burst out, so you were the one who stole it. Michelle was taken aback at the sudden appearance of Chris. What are you doing here? Confused, she looked at Christy standing nearby, who couldn't help but burst into laughter. Big sis, you're so naive. You've always underestimated us, and that's why you were tricked so easily. Christy then turned serious and pulled out her phone. Just so you know, I recorded our conversation. Michelle glared at Christy resentfully, then turned to plead with me and Chris. I'm so sorry. I never meant to trouble Emily. It was just a moment of weakness. Chris, I'm sorry for saying such terrible things to you. Michelle suddenly burst into a tirade, and then, right there, she knelt down and apologized to us. Stop it, sis. It's embarrassing. I'll report this to Jeff, so just wait. Running away is useless, you know? Stunned by Christy's words, my sister-in-law began to sob right there. Urged by Christy's "let's go," Chris and I decided to leave the scene. Afterward, the three of us headed to Emily's apartment. The whole truth of the incident was revealed by Christy, proving Chris's innocence. But Emily never doubted Chris at all. I explained, but it seemed the two siblings understood each other's feelings well enough. Anyway, it was decided that we would move out of the apartment immediately. Due to the hardships of the past year, there was hardly any luggage in the room. It took less than an hour to pack up everything. Let's go home for now. After a light meal, the four of us returned to the house where Jeff was waiting. I see. Hearing our explanation and bringing Emily back home, Jeff let out a deep sigh. We played him the recording Christy made of her conversation with Michelle and explained everything. Shocked to learn of his sister's crime, Jeff seemed deeply affected. However, accepting the truth, he spoke heavily. I'm truly sorry for doubting you. Jeff sincerely apologized. Chris accepted the apology with a nod. Christy, send me that audio file. I'm going to the police now. Jeff, resolute, decided to report the theft by Michelle and her husband to the police. It must have taken immense courage for him to make this decision. But now, maybe we were finally freed from his sister's control. A few days later, the police, informed by Jeff, arrested Michelle and her husband. The evidence of theft was clear in their bank account, and they quickly confessed. For a real estate company that relies on trust, this arrest was devastating. According to Jeff, who visited the police station as a relative of the accused, Michelle's mental state was deteriorating day by day. Betrayed by her brother and sister, she was in shock. Moreover, she seemed to understand that her real hell would begin after serving her sentence. The survival of their company was doubtful, and their luxurious lifestyle was now impossible. It was self-inflicted, but I couldn't help feeling a little sorry for Jeff. The money meant for Emily was returned from another account of Michelle and her husband. With that money, Emily rented a new apartment, this time without relying on them. Chris, along with Christy, started a small design company. This might be a good opportunity, Christy had decided. Seeing Chris like this seemed to lighten Jeff's load. Although he still felt guilty for doubting his son, they began to talk more than before. As a result, I felt closer to Jeff than I had in the past. Although Emily and Chris suffered because of Michelle, this incident brought our family closer together. It was truly a case of, after the rain, the ground hardens. With Chris working, our family finances improved, but I decided to continue working too. Watching everyone, I couldn't help but feel the same.
Me. From now on, we would move forward together, including Christy as a family of 5.